But I moved back to Albany because I was writing in Puerto Rico and I didn't understand who this Van Rensselaer fellow was and why Eddie Carey was called a squire of North Albany, what was a squire in Albany's lexicon, and why did Eddie live at the top of Van Rensselaer Boulevard, and why had I always lived at the bottom in one of his houses? Why was the North End, my neighborhood, almost exclusively Catholic and Irish and Democratic, and how could such a thing happen? I moved back to Albany to get answers, and I vowed I would research the North End and its ethnic blueprints, its political history, and the nature of its people. But before I could make my plans known to anybody, Walter Hoover, an editor of the Times-Union, where I'd signed on as a part-time short-timer, asked me to write a series on the city's neighborhoods and how they came to be. I took this as a gift from the gods, the literary editor in the sky, and I reveled in the 4 months it took me to write it. The series, I believed, was a masterpiece of durability, but it was about as durable as the flimsy paper it was printed on, or as the neighborhoods that were its subject. For all those neighborhoods had been turned inside out since I wrote about them, and this was written in '83, and they've been turned inside out again since those 80 years, but I was talking about the 60s. And even a few of them have been atomized as if they've never existed. It was in these years that my mind changed on Albany, that I came to see it as an inexhaustible context for the stories I planned to write, as abundant in mythic qualities as it was in political ambition, remarkably consequential greed, and genuine fear of the Lord. I saw it as being as various as the American psyche itself, of which it was truly a crucible. It's one of the oldest chartered cities in the U.S. and will celebrate its tricentennial in 1986. It was a primeval and savage wilderness to the early settlers, those agents of the first patroon and the Dutch West India Company pioneers, just as the far west would be to the Western American pioneers of the 19th century. It had a history as long before the Revolutionary War, in which it was a key city. It was headquarters in the campaign against Burgoyne, as it has been since that war. It's always been commercially important, first because of the Dutch fur trade. In 1656, the trappers of Albany, then called Fort Orange, slew 30,000 beaver for their pelts. And also because of the Hudson River. Later it became the eastern terminus of the Erie Canal, and later still a railroad center, which made it a cattle town, a bit of the Wild West and the Old East. It was a city of foundries and lumber, and its sinful ways made it the hottest town between New York and Montreal. It was as much a melting pot as New York or Boston, and it epitomizes the transfer of power from the Dutch to the English and to the ethnic coalitions. In Albany, the power became, in my childhood, adolescence, early manhood, and senescence, it has been controlled by the Irish. And the power came to be centered singularly in preceding Boston and putting an Irishman in City Hall. But the Irish couldn't have done it without help from the WASPs, most notably a Yankee family whose heir to great wealth and greater significance held power until 1983. And Jack knows that story extremely well, having worked with the gentleman in question whose name was Erastus Corning II. The Irish WASP collaboration created a matchless political record, uninterrupted control of the city since 1921. The Irish boss was Dan O'Connell. He died in 1977 at age 91, and his third mayor was Erastus, who was elected in 1941 and at the age of 72 in 1981 was elected to his 11th consecutive four-year term, which was a historical record, unmatched. Just as Dan O'Connell's record, I think, is unmatched. For longevity, we have nothing close in this country, or even in the world. Ethelred III, Augustus. Albany's been a springboard to the presidency. Martin Van Buren, Millard Fillmore was a state controller. Grover Cleveland, Teddy and Franklin, among those who made it. Samuel Tilden, Charles Evans Hughes, Al Smith, Tom Dewey, Averill Harriman, Nelson Rockefeller, among the other fellows. Nelson made it to the vice presidency, that ignominious office of standby equipment that he scorned until it was the only bauble left for him. In Albany, he was more significant. The builder of the South Mall, that billion-dollar monument he foresaw as a hymn to forever, its vast acres of marble designed to be whispering, "Nelson, Nelson," to the silent infinity next door long after the last of us has gone away. Literarily, what can one say of Albany? Melville was schooled here but went to sea. Cooper hobnobbed with the patroon. Henry James's grandfather, William, founded the James dynasty here, but Henry came to visit rarely after childhood. Emerson lectured to the Young Men's Association. William Cullen Bryant, one of the forgotten men in American letters, was feted at the governor's mansion by Governor Tilden in 1875 at what was then described as the greatest literary event in the city's history. Bret Hart was born here and left almost immediately. Came back as a mature celebrity, but was snubbed by the press and left in a terminal huff and died in England trying to forget the place. Harold Frederick worked here as an editor of the Albany Evening Journal. Dickens read from A Christmas Carol at Tweddle Hall. Mark Twain defended osteopathy at the Capitol. Robert Louis Stevenson passed through on his way to the Adirondacks. Edith Wharton's great friend Walter Van Rensselaer Berry grew up here. Joyce may have referred to the place secretly in Finnegan's Wake. Hemingway married Martha Gellhorn, who about 1931 was hit on by the city editor of the Times-Union, where she was a neophyte reporter, and she left after about 6 months and probably in leaving the city editor in her wake, went on to hang out with Hemingway. And of course, William Faulkner died unaware that Albany ever existed. Geographically, this Albany exists 150 miles north of Manhattan and during the racing season, 35 miles south of Saratoga. It's centered squarely in the American and the human continuum, a magical place where the past becomes visible if one is willing to track the multiple incarnations of the city's soul. I confront even a single street corner, and there emerges an archetypal as well as an historical context in which to view the mutations of its trees and its telephone poles. It is the task of this and other books I have written and hope to write to peer into the heart of this always shifting past, to be there when it ceases to be what it is, what it was, and when it becomes what it must become under scrutiny, when it turns so magically and so inevitably from then into now. Okay. And,